There's something no one tells you about people who push away love, especially the kind of love that's real, steady, and emotionally honest. See, when someone pushes you away, your mind scrambles to make sense of it. You start thinking maybe you weren't good enough, or maybe they didn't really care as much as they claimed. But here's the truth. People with avoidant tendencies don't always push love away because it's wrong. Sometimes they push it away because it's exactly what they need. And that terrifies them. When a person who's wired to protect themselves emotionally meets someone who sees them, understands them, and gently calls them forward into something deeper, they panic. Not because you're the problem, but because they start to see the version of themselves they could become in your presence. And that version requires change. It requires vulnerability, openness, being seen without all the armor. And for someone who's learned to equate emotional intimacy with danger or control, that feels like standing at the edge of a cliff. So, they leave. Maybe not physically at first, but emotionally. They retreat, withdraw, close off, give mixed signals. And when they finally let you go, there's a moment, brief, cold, convincing, where they feel relief. Like they dodged something overwhelming. But relief is short-lived because silence creates space. And in that space, they start remembering your presence, your steadiness, your affection, your laughter, the way you didn't run when things got uncomfortable, the way you saw past their masks. Avoidants have this battle inside. They want love, deeply, desperately. But they fear what love demands. Love demands exposure. Love demands healing. Love demands the death of ego. So they push away the very person who made them feel safe enough to try. And when you walk away, that's when the real reckoning begins for them. Because now the fantasy of emotional independence is confronted by the reality of loneliness. That silence they used to crave becomes a haunting echo. They'll think about you when they hear a song that sounds like the playlist you used to make together. They'll rehearse conversations in their heads they never had the courage to speak. What if I just told them how scared I was? What if I had stayed? These thoughts won't be loud. They won't tell their friends, but they'll feel it when they see your name pop up on social media, or when it doesn't, when they realize you're no longer waiting. The irony, you were the safe place they never knew they needed. You were the lesson wrapped in kindness. But some lessons don't get learned until the moment has passed, and some people don't see the value of a calm, healing presence until they've chased enough chaos to understand what peace really looks like. So if someone pushed you away and you're stuck questioning your worth, don't personalize someone else's fear. Don't let their inability to receive love define your ability to give it. Sometimes people lose the right person not because the love wasn't mutual, but because they hadn't yet grown into the version of themselves capable of holding it. And maybe, just maybe, your absence will become the space where they finally meet that version of themselves. There's a quiet irony in how some people react when they meet someone who genuinely sees them, accepts them, and offers real emotional intimacy. While it would seem logical to move closer to that kind of love, people with avoidant tendencies often move away. They retreat not because the connection is flawed, but because it feels too right. When something feels too aligned, too safe, too emotionally real, it taps into parts of them they've worked hard to bury. Love, in its purest form, can be terrifying to someone who's used to self-protection as a way of life. Imagine spending your entire emotional development building walls to avoid disappointment, rejection, or dependence. Then suddenly, someone shows up who doesn't climb over your wall or try to tear it down. They just patiently wait outside, offering warmth and presence. That is unsettling in a way most people don't understand. For someone with avoidant tendencies, it's not that they don't want love. They do, deeply. But they've also equated love with loss of freedom, with vulnerability, with losing control. The closer they get to a person who offers genuine emotional connection, the more exposed they feel. And that exposure isn't exciting, it's destabilizing. So when they begin to feel too much, they tell themselves stories to rationalize pulling away. They say things like, "It's not the right time," or "We're too different," or "I'm not ready." But underneath those excuses lies a more complicated truth. You made them feel something they weren't ready to feel. You mirrored back a version of them they might have secretly wanted to become, but didn't yet know how to step into. Your emotional safety, your steadiness, your empathy. It called them forward. It asked them to drop their defenses, to sit with their own discomfort, to trust that love wouldn't hurt them the way it did in the past. This is the paradox when someone feels truly seen, truly understood, and truly accepted. It often forces them to confront the parts of themselves they've long hidden. And if they haven't yet done that inner work, the experience of intimacy feels overwhelming rather than comforting. It's not about you being wrong for them. It's about the fact that you made them feel too much, too deeply, too fast. And for someone used to running from emotions, that's like being thrown into deep water without learning to swim. People with avoidant patterns often find themselves most comfortable in relationships where there's emotional distance, where the stakes are lower, where they're in control. But you didn't offer distance, you offered presence, you didn't play games, you spoke clearly, you didn't withhold affection, you gave it freely. That kind of love, honest, secure, emotionally mature, acts as a mirror. It shows them where they're still hurting, where they still don't trust, where they're still holding back. They may have told themselves you were too intense or that the connection was too much. But in reality, they felt the weight of your love and didn't yet believe they could carry it. They didn't trust themselves to stay, to commit, to be vulnerable without losing themselves. And rather than admit that, they pushed you away. Not because you weren't right, but because you were, and that truth scared them far more than being alone. So when an avoidant pushes someone away, it's rarely about flaws in the relationship. More often, it's about the internal war between craving connection and fearing what connection requires. They want to be held, but they fear needing anyone. They want intimacy, but they fear the surrender it demands. And when someone shows up offering everything they quietly long for, the fear often wins the first round. When an avoidant person pushes someone away, there's usually a moment of emotional release. A brief window where they feel a strange sense of peace or clarity. That internal voice says, "This is what I needed. Now I can breathe." It's a deceptive moment because what they're experiencing isn't true relief. It's the numbing effect of having removed themselves from emotional vulnerability. For someone who is wired to seek safety in solitude, letting go of intimacy feels like reclaiming control. They convince themselves that walking away was the right decision, that it was necessary for their emotional stability. But that feeling is fleeting, because relief, especially when born out of fear or avoidance, never lingers for long. What follows next is subtle. It doesn't crash in like a wave, it drips in slowly, quietly. Regret never arrives with sirens. It shows up in those small, inconvenient moments. The quiet evenings when there's no one to talk to. The simple decisions that suddenly feel heavier without someone to share them with. The moments when they instinctively want to send a message, ask for advice, or share a laugh, but realize they've lost the right person to do that with. And it's not because you've done anything wrong. In fact, it's because you did everything right. You were emotionally consistent, you were vulnerable, present, and willing to love. But your presence created a pressure they weren't yet equipped to handle, so they let you go. In the aftermath, the avoidant begins to notice the absence of things they once overlooked. Your patience, your soft reminders, your texts in the morning just to check in, the way you made room for their silence without demanding constant performance. These things didn't always register while you were there. Because when someone's fighting their own emotions, they can't always see the value of someone who shows up with love. But once you're gone, everything echoes louder. The absence creates contrast. What once felt suffocating now feels like oxygen they can't breathe in anymore. And as they sit in the space they created, they begin to ask questions, silently, to themselves. Did I push too hard? Did I leave something real behind? These questions aren't always answered out loud. Most avoidant people won't reach out with full honesty. Pride gets in the way. Fear of rejection shows up, and sometimes they tell themselves they're protecting you by staying silent when really they're just avoiding their own emotional reckoning. But internally, the regret brews. They scroll through old photos or past conversations. They watch your life from a distance, wondering if you've moved on, hoping you haven't yet. And if you have, a strange emptiness creeps in because the story they told themselves, that this was for the best, no longer holds up under the weight of what they truly feel. They didn't expect to miss the ordinary things: your voice, your support, the way you reminded them they were lovable even when they felt unworthy, and missing you doesn't come with peace, it comes with restlessness. Avoidants often convince themselves that detachment is strength, that walking away is a form of self-preservation. But strength isn't found in shutting down, it's found in facing discomfort, sitting in it, and choosing connection anyway. The regret they feel is a reflection of the disconnect between what they said they wanted and what they actually needed. And while they may not say it out loud, they know. Deep down, they know they had something rare, something healing, something that asked them to be brave, not in dramatic ways, but in simple, intimate ones. And they walked away before they could fully understand what it meant. So the regret lingers, not just about losing you, but about not being ready to become the version of themselves who could have stayed. Avoidants are often misunderstood. On the surface, they may come across as emotionally distant, uninterested, or even cold. But beneath that guarded exterior lies a complex emotional world. They do want love, sometimes more intensely than they're willing to admit even to themselves. But love, to them, isn't just connection. It's vulnerability, risk, surrender. And that's the very part that scares them. To open up is to lose control, and to lose control is to expose old wounds that may never have fully healed. What's often overlooked is that avoidant individuals didn't simply wake up one day and decide to avoid love. Many of them carry deep emotional imprints from earlier experiences, perhaps in childhood, where closeness was inconsistent or even painful. Maybe they had to self-soothe to figure things out on their own, to survive emotionally in environments that didn't feel safe or predictable. As a result, they learned to equate independence with safety. Relying on someone else felt dangerous. Needing someone felt weak. So even when they crave connection, that craving triggers fear. It's a push-pull dynamic that confuses both them and the people they care about. This fear of vulnerability becomes a silent operating system in their relationships. They might flirt with closeness, enjoy the affection, even dream of a future, but the moment things become emotionally intense, their instinct isn't to lean in, it's to pull back. They start to question everything. Am I ready for this? What if I lose myself? What if they see who I really am and leave? These aren't just casual thoughts, they are deep, almost reflexive defense mechanisms that exist to keep emotional pain at a distance. The most tragic part is that many avoidants don't even realize they're doing this. To them, pulling back feels like a logical decision. They tell themselves they need space, clarity, time to think. But what they're really doing is protecting themselves from the terrifying possibility of being hurt again. Not just hurt in the usual way, but the kind of hurt that comes from giving your whole heart to someone and then losing them. Or worse, being seen, being vulnerable, and then being rejected. So rather than risk that outcome, they retreat. Not because they don't care, but because they care too much and have no idea how to navigate that intensity without losing themselves. This is why avoidants often feel safest in relationships where they are needed, but not deeply known. Where there is distance, where expectations remain manageable. But when someone shows up and offers deep love, emotional security, and consistent presence, it rattles them. It exposes the parts of themselves they've avoided confronting. Being loved in a healthy, steady way is not just foreign, it's overwhelming. Because healthy love asks for honesty, vulnerability, and interdependence. And that goes against everything they've learned to survive. Inside, they might feel a yearning they can't quite articulate. A sense of missing something, even when everything appears fine on the surface. They might fantasize about intimacy, about holding someone close and being truly seen, but they don't always trust themselves to handle it. So they keep their hearts wrapped in layers of logic, independence, and emotional boundaries. But none of that means they don't want love. It just means that love, to them, feels like fire, beautiful, powerful, and capable of burning everything they've built to stay safe. And so when they walk away from someone who truly loved them, it's rarely out of indifference. It's often because they reached the threshold of what they could emotionally tolerate. They left not to hurt the other person, but to protect the parts of themselves still terrified of being known. The longing remains, but it hides beneath a thick layer of fear. And until they begin to confront that fear, not with shame, but with compassion, they'll continue to crave the very love they push away. There's a haunting loneliness that follows someone who pushed away the person who once made them feel most understood. It doesn't show up immediately. It doesn't make a loud entrance. Instead, it comes late at night, in quiet moments when they're finally alone with their thoughts. They start to replay things they never said, rehearsing conversations in their mind, scenes where they imagine saying what they were too afraid to speak out loud. Words like, "I miss you," or "I wasn't ready, but I cared more than I let on," or simply, "I was scared." These imaginary conversations become a mental refuge, a space where they can say the things they withheld, where vulnerability feels safe because it's not being spoken into the real world. They may never admit this, not to you, and sometimes not even to themselves in any fully conscious way. But they revisit memories like sacred pages from a book they now realize they never finished reading. The inside jokes, the private smiles, the deep talks that only you two could understand, those become the background music in their mental landscape. They create mental scripts where things ended differently, where they allowed themselves to stay, where they showed up with honesty instead of distance. These rehearsed conversations are often filled with the kind of emotional clarity they didn't allow themselves to access when the relationship was alive. Because when fear ruled their decisions, clarity was the first thing to be sacrificed. But now that time has passed and the space between you has grown, there's room to reflect. Not out loud, not through an apology or message, but in their mind, they go back and try to rewrite the past, word by word, choice by choice. It's not a conscious game, it's a form of emotional processing. Their version of closure, or sometimes their penance. They might picture seeing you again and finally saying everything they held back. Not to win you back necessarily, but because part of them aches for you to know that their silence wasn't proof of apathy. It was proof of fear, of confusion, of emotional immaturity. In these mental dialogues, they're able to say, "I didn't know how to love you the way you needed," or "You were the first person who saw me clearly, and I wasn't ready to be seen." These words would never have passed their lips during the relationship, but they flow freely in the safety of their own thoughts, where there's no risk of rejection, no vulnerability to manage. What's more heartbreaking is that these internal conversations usually happen long after the other person has moved on. Long after you've learned to stop checking your phone or wondering if they'll come around. Because while you were sitting in the silence they created, trying to heal, they were sitting in that same silence. Building a world of unspoken words, it's a quiet torment, this need to express love or remorse without having the courage or timing to bring it into the light. Sometimes they'll scroll through your social media, seeing your smile or your progress, and the words will stir again. "I wonder if they ever think of me. Would they understand if I explained it now?" But the longer they wait, the heavier those words become and the more impossible they feel to release. So they stay trapped in a loop of mental rehearsals and emotional what-ifs. They imagine what they would say if they had one more chance. They write you messages they'll never send. They picture what it would feel like to hear your voice again, just once, so they could say the truth with the softness they never allowed themselves before. In the end, those silent conversations are where they keep you. Not in reality, not in action, but in the space where vulnerability finally feels manageable because it lives only in their imagination. There comes a moment long after the chaos has settled and the noise has faded when the reality of loss begins to take shape. For the avoidant, this moment doesn't arrive with drama or urgency. It creeps in subtly after the last message has been left on read, after the final conversation has closed with polite indifference, and after life seems to have returned to normal. That's when they start to feel it. Not the drama of the goodbye, but the silence that follows. It's in that silence that the true weight of losing someone loving, consistent, and safe begins to make itself known. At first, they may feel liberated. The emotional tension that built up in the relationship, whether real or self-created, has finally been released. They no longer feel the pressure of being emotionally available, of being seen, of meeting someone in the vulnerable space where true connection happens. But over time, what once felt like freedom begins to resemble emptiness. The space they created to breathe, to think, to escape, becomes a vacuum where warmth used to live. And that warmth wasn't just about romance or passion. It was the presence of someone who made them feel emotionally safe. Someone who didn't demand perfection, but invited authenticity. Someone who didn't flinch when they withdrew, but stayed long enough to say, "I'm here." The absence of that kind of presence is not loud. It doesn't announce itself with loneliness in the obvious ways. It shows up in the subtle disorientation of realizing no one is checking in anymore. It shows up in the mornings when the phone is quiet, in the moments when something good happens and they instinctively think of you, only to remember that line of communication is closed. They begin to notice the difference between being alone by choice and being alone in reality, and while they may not express it outwardly, they begin to understand what they truly gave up. It's not just the person they miss, it's the feeling they had when they were with you. The ease of being understood without having to explain everything. The comfort of knowing someone had their back even when they were emotionally unpredictable. The way you celebrated their strengths, but also gently challenged their fears. That kind of emotional environment is rare, and once it's gone, they realize that it wasn't pressure, it was peace. It wasn't threat, it was safety. But they only see that after it's too late to go back. They remember the conversations that went deeper than surface level. The silence that didn't feel awkward, the trust that was slowly building even while they resisted it. In hindsight, those moments take on a new glow. The value of your presence becomes clearer now that it's missing, and they might not reach out. They might never say the words out loud, but internally they begin to grieve, not just the relationship, but the version of themselves they could have become if they had stayed. You were not just a person in their life, you were an invitation to grow, to soften, to risk being loved in a way that doesn't hurt. And they declined that invitation, not because it lacked worth, but because they didn't yet feel worthy of it. Now, in your absence, they begin to see what was possible, what was being offered, what they were too afraid to hold. This grief doesn't come with tears for everyone. For some, it shows up as numbness. For others, as a slow burning ache. It becomes a quiet realization that in pushing you away, they weren't just protecting themselves from pain, they were also blocking themselves from peace. And the echo of your love, once dismissed or taken for granted, becomes the sound they long for most when the world finally grows quiet. When someone pushes you away, especially someone with an avoidant attachment style, it's easy to question everything, your worth, your love, your actions. But what you need to understand is that their rejection was never a reflection of your inadequacy. It was a reflection of their fear. Fear of being seen, fear of being vulnerable, fear of what it means to be truly loved without conditions. You showed up with presence, with emotional generosity, and with patience. You gave them a version of love that didn't demand, but invited. And sometimes people aren't ready for the invitation. They may walk away convincing themselves it was the right choice. They may chase clarity through solitude, thinking they need space when what they truly need is healing. But in time, when the silence grows louder than their defenses, and your absence becomes more real than their temporary comfort, they will feel the loss. They will rehearse the words they never said. They will reflect on what they had and realize it wasn't too much. It was everything they secretly wanted, but didn't believe they could hold. If you're hurting right now, if you're confused or grieving the loss of someone who couldn't choose you even when the love was real, let this be your reminder you didn't lose because you weren't enough. You loved in a way that was strong, pure, and courageous. And while they may not have been able to meet you there, your love planted a seed that may grow into a lesson they carry with them forever. Your job now is not to chase them. Your job is not to wait for closure. Your job is to continue becoming someone who doesn't abandon themselves when others walk away. Because the kind of love you offer deserves to be received, not just desired, not just almost held, but fully embraced by someone who's ready. So keep your heart open, not for them, but for you, for the version of your life that includes someone who doesn't flinch at your depth, who doesn't run from your truth, and who chooses you not in fear, but in full awareness of your value. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart. You're worth every bit of the love you give. Goodbye, and thank you.